Good morning, and thank you for joining the latest installment of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. My name is Chris Williams, and I'm honored to serve as chair of the Moorman Center for Space Studies. We're proud to uphold the name and legacy of General Tom Moorman, a pillar of the national security space establishment and a friend to many. Also, a quick thank you to our speakers, moderators, sponsors, and viewers of last week's TSSCI level Space Warfighters Conference. Over 500 viewers heard enlightening classified presentations by senior national security space officials from across the Department of Defense and intelligence community. Thanks again for making this event such a success. And just a brief look ahead. This Thursday, July 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, NSSA is hosting a webinar entitled Space Legacy GPS. We at NSSA are deeply committed to honoring the pioneers of the U.S. national security space enterprise. And this, the second in our series of interviews with national security space legends, focuses on the early years of the GPS program. You will not want to miss this remarkable video presentation hosted by Lieutenant General Larry James, U.S. Air Force retired, and now Deputy Director of NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. For more information on this event and other materials, including past SpaceTime interviews, please visit us at www.nssaspace.org. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, Commander, Space Operations Command, or SPOC, U.S. Space Force. Lieutenant General Whiting, welcome. We're glad to have you, sir. Space Operations Command is a field command of the U.S. Space Force, headquartered at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, and is comprised of thousands of Guardians worldwide. As SPOC Commander, Lieutenant General Whiting leads the preparation, generation, and sustainment of combat-ready intelligence, cyber, space, and combat support forces, and services as the U.S. Space Force service component to U.S. Space Command. Lieutenant General Whiting has had a highly distinguished career. He graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy with a degree in aeronautical engineering. He's a space operations officer and has commanded the 13th Space Warning Squadron, the 614th Air and Space Operations Center and Joint Space Operations Center, the 21st Space Wing, and the Combined Force Space Component Command and 14th Air Force. Lieutenant General Whiting's staff assignments include positions at Headquarters U.S. Air Force, U.S. Space Command, U.S. Strategic Command, the Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Study Group, the Office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Headquarters Air Force Space Command, and Headquarters U.S. Space Force, a truly distinguished career for a fine officer. A brief note about our format today. Lieutenant General Whiting will make some opening remarks followed by a Q&A session. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will endeavor to get to as many of your questions as possible in the 60 minutes allotted for today's interview. I'm also pleased to announce that Lieutenant General Kevin McLaughlin, U.S. Air Force retired, former Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and a distinguished member of the NSSA Board of Advisors, will be joining me for the Q&A portion of our discussion. Kevin, thanks so much for your time and welcome. Lieutenant General Whiting, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for your devoted service to our nation's defense. And without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Hey, many thanks, Chris. I really appreciate the opportunity that the National Security Space Association has given me to come and talk about Space Operations Command. It's great to be with you and with Lieutenant General McLaughlin. I'll also note he is a distinguished Space Operations officer as well, and an officer I looked up to in my career, as he was just a little bit ahead of me, commanding and doing great things for our nation. But really excited to talk about the great work that our Guardians and Airmen in Space Operations Command, or SPOC, as you noted, are doing. Now, let me just say right up front, we did not call it SPOC because of Star Trek, but I'm also not necessarily opposed to that because I am a fan of sci-fi. But SPOC is a term that's been used in our enterprise for decades and decades, and we thought in the end it was the right acronym for this warfighting command. But I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about the historical trends that have brought us to today, where we have a Space Force, another iteration of U.S. Space Command, and then what we're doing inside of SPOC. But, you know, we're building on 70 plus years of history of space supporting national defense and being embedded inside of national defense organizations. You can go all the way back to 1946. The first study that Hap Arnold ever commissioned with the RAND Corporation was about the benefits of an Earth orbiting satellite. That goes back to the Army Air Forces. And then, of course, in 1947, the Air Force becomes an independent service, being birthed out of the Air Force. And for a decade, they're thinking about space, knowing that it's coming, it's going to be important, but it's not until 1957 where we see the Soviets finally successfully launch Sputnik that the space age begins. And of course, we are trying to match that launch, have folks out there like von Braun or General Schriever. I recently read the book on him, the biography, A Fiery Peace in a Cold War, that tells that story of us trying to build ICBMs and space launch capabilities. But by 1959, the Air Force had done that, and we had entered the space age. And then from about 1959 to the early 80s, a period of about 25 years or so, various organizations in the U.S. Air Force were dealing with space. Strategic Air Command had aspects of it. Air Force Systems Command and others, Air Defense Command, all had various space aspects. And by the early 80s, some real visionaries in the Air Force realized we need to pull together all those capabilities. And so Air Force Space Command was stood up here in Colorado Springs in 1982, right here in the headquarters where I sit today. And that was a seminal moment for us in the Department of Defense, because very quickly thereafter, the Army and Navy stood up space commands, and then we stood up the first iteration of United States Space Command in 1985. Think back to that time. This was the middle of the Cold War. The Soviets were fielding counter space weapons to go after our strategic space capabilities. We were publicly testing ASAT weapons. I mean, space was a contested domain. It's why we stood up U.S. Space Command. And for those 5 years from 1985 until about 1990, when the wall came down, that's what we were laser focused on. And then the wall did come down, and Soviet Union quickly dissolved. The Soviets the Russians ran out of money to continue to build their counter space capabilities, and the Chinese had not yet developed that capability. So we really did kind of go into this benign period where we were able to field a whole host of space constellations and capabilities that weren't threatened by counter space. But it doesn't mean we weren't thinking about it and we weren't seeing those threats, because by about 2000, the Congress had commissioned the Rumsfeld Commission to go look at the National Organization of, or the Organization of National Security Space. And I hadn't thought about this in the beginning, but I think a Lieutenant Colonel Kevin McLaughlin was one of the key military members, if not the key military member on that commission. And he'll correct my history here. But that commission reported out right as the Bush administration was coming into office in 2001, and Donald Rumsfeld was becoming the Secretary of Defense. And that commission said some interesting things. It said we are not organized for the threat we're going to soon face. And it said we need to be looking at standing up a separate Space Corps inside the Department of the Air Force within the midterm. And I think it defined that as kind of 5 to 10 year point. Donald Rumsfeld comes into the Department of Defense. He starts implementing those recommendations to include that the Air Force should become the executive agent for all DoD space. And for about 8 or 9 months, that's the path we were on. And then, of course, the tragic events of 9/11 happened. And the nation's focus turned in a different direction as we had to take on this counterterrorism fight. The nation soon decided that we could only have a fixed number, I think it was 9 at the time, of combatant commands, and we needed to stand up a new combatant command, U.S. Northern Command, to defend our homeland. And so U.S. Space Command was stood down. I was actually at U.S. Space Command at that time. I was one of the few members of U.S. Space Command who actually drove to Offutt, Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, in the summer of 2003 as STRATCOM took on those space responsibilities at the combatant command level. And so that's kind of the structure that we ended up in post 9/11. STRATCOM did a lot of really good things with the space mission. And I ended up at Vandenberg in 2006 running the Joint Space Operations Center for then Major General Willie Shelton. And in 2007, I sat in a small room in a nascent organization called the Joint Functional Component Command for Space with General Shelton and then Lieutenant Colonel Chance Saltzman and then Major Deanna Burt. And we watched the Chinese ASAT test unfold. And we knew the world had changed that day. It took about a decade for the rest of the nation to realize that and for us to be able to talk about that broadly. But that's what ended up driving and future investments by the Chinese and then the Russians in counter space capabilities that drove the nation in August of 2019 to stand up the new US Space Command. I was in the Rose Garden for that ceremony as the first commander of the Combined Force Space Component Command. And then a few months later, President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act, creating the 6th branch of the Armed Forces, US Space Force. So now we have a new service and a new combatant command. And how are we going to organize these? Well, throughout 2000, that's the work we've been doing. And I'm going to talk about that today. But in July of 2020, we stood up our new tactical level organizations, our deltas and our garrisons. And then in October of last year, we stood up the first field command or Space Operations Command, SpOC. And we sit at the nexus of these two organizations. We are a field command, the operational component of US Space Force, but we're the Space Force service component to US Space Command. So both of those 4-star generals, General Raymond on the service side and General Dickinson on the joint side, are my bosses as we execute these operations. So let me talk about what we've been doing in SpOC over the last 9 months since we've stood up. Our mission is to protect America and our allies in, from, and to space now and into the future. We picked those words, obviously, with great thought and care. We wanted a mission statement that spoke to not only our headquarters, but also to all the assigned guardians and airmen in our deltas and in our garrisons. And I think every member of SpOC can look at that mission statement and say, yeah, that's what I show up to do every day at work. I protect America and our allies, and I do that by ensuring that we're defending America in, from, and to space. And then we highlight that we have to do that now and into the future. The now is the Fight Tonight force. As the presented force from US Space Force to US Space Command, we're employed every day on behalf of the nation. So we do have to be ready to fight tonight with the threats that face us or any contingencies that happen around the world. But we also have to be looking to the future. And so any funded system that's coming to us in the palm, we are responsible in Space Operations Command to make sure that we're doing the work to be ready to integrate that capability when it arrives on our doorstep and we have to employ it. And so there is this future-looking aspect of our job, even as we are the Fight Tonight force. Now, our vision statement is that we are America's space warfighters, always ready, always innovative, and always above. If we have created the Space Force for no other purpose, it is to have a laser focus on building space warfighters. And as the operational arm of US Space Force, we want all of our guardians and airmen, civilian and military alike, to know that they are space warfighters and that we have to be ready to execute those operations in peacetime and in war tonight if called upon. And then we highlight always ready, and I'm going to come back to readiness multiple times today because it is the coin of the realm for SpOC. We do have to have combat readiness to be ready for that Fight Tonight force. Always innovative. This is one of the real aspects we're trying to drive through our culture across Space Force, across Space Comm, but certainly in SpOC to be more innovative and push that innovation down to all levels. And then we note that we want to be always above, calling ourselves to that aspirational level of performance in everything we do, whether our personal conduct or operational performance. And of course, always above links to our service motto of Semper Supra, which is Latin for always above. And then we have 3 priorities, preparing, partnering, and projecting. So sometimes in SpOC, we talk about the 4 Ps. The first P being our mission to protect, and then our 3 priorities, preparing, partnering, and projecting. When we talk about preparing, the bumper sticker we like to use, and I really think this encapsulates all that we do in SpOC, we have to prepare combat-ready, ISR-led, cyber-secure space and combat support forces. Now, the 3 core competencies of SpOC are intelligence, cyber, and operations. And so when we talk about preparing combat-ready, ISR-led, cyber-secure space and combat support forces, we're talking about how we bring all of that together. Everything we do has to be relative to these new threats that we face. So that's why we highlight being ISR-led. Everything we do has to be cyber-secure. We operate global networks that extend all around the world, but also extend out to all orbital regimes. to GEO, to MEO, to LEO, to HEO. And so cyber is our soft underbelly, and it's a lower bar of entry for other actors to try to deny us our space capability in cyber. And this is one of the reasons we've brought in a cyber workforce into U.S. Space Force. We also, when we think about preparing priority, we talk about preparing an empowered, diverse, and healthy warfighting culture. Empowerment is another aspect of the culture that we're really focused on. Of course, we want all of our Guardians and Airmen, no matter what their backgrounds and no matter what their gender, race, ethnicity, to have the opportunity to rise to absolute the level of their talents, and that they have the full opportunity to contribute. And then we do want a warfighting culture that's healthy in the positive leadership that we bring. On the partnering priority, I think this is an area space enterprise does pretty well in, because space is a team sport. We've never operated in a silo, but we absolutely are laser focused on working with and across our U.S. government stakeholders and teammates, with our allies, and with commercial partners. We have been in the unique position here at SpOC of supporting other Space Force organizations as they stand up. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but for example, Space Training and Readiness Command, or STARCOM, they're pretty much starting out at a headquarters level from zero. So they've been a part of us for the last 9 months, and we will birth them out eventually. We've been supporting Space and Missile Systems Center as they become Space Systems Command with the Launch Enterprise. We'll pass that Launch Enterprise to them when they fully stand up as SSC. We've been supporting the space staff in the Pentagon as they've been growing, because when President Trump signed that act back in December of 19, there was virtually no staff in the Pentagon except for General D.T. Thompson's small office at the time of about 10 or 11 people. Well, now they're growing to become a service staff, so we're handing those functions to them, and we are getting down to our fighting weight, focused on being that fight tonight force and the service component for U.S. Space Command. And that's the last way we think about partnering. SpOC is the service component and the largest of Space Command's service components. So we know we have to be a vital, engaged service component on behalf of General Dickinson and Lieutenant General Shaw. And so that's a principal focus area for us here at our headquarters. And then the last of our priorities is projecting. When we think about projecting, we're talking about projecting combat power in, from, and to space. And then also projecting an innovative and digitized force. Innovation, again, one of those areas we're really pushing in our culture. And then General Raymond has called us as Space Force to be the first digital force, and we have an aspect of that. And so we want to be full partners in projecting that digitized force. All right, let me move on to talk about some headquarters Space Operations Command, or headquarters SpOC roles. I mentioned earlier our overall mission statement of defending America and our allies in, from, and to space now and into the future. Here at the headquarters, our unique contribution to that is that we generate, present, and sustain combat-ready space and combat support forces, and then we serve as that service component to U.S. Space Command. We intentionally did not choose the words organize, train, and equip. We made that choice for 2 reasons. One is, coming from our Air Force background, it's just too easy to let those roll off our tongue. Oh, we OT&E. And we don't even really pause and think about what those words mean. And in our new Space Force structure, we are no longer the equipping command. We have a command, Space and Missile Systems Center, soon to be Space Systems Command, that does that for us. We're about to have a training command, STARCOM, that will do a bulk of our training. So we picked a different set of verbs, and we picked generate, present, and sustain. Now, one of our civil engineers on the staff pointed out, after we had picked those verbs, that they actually become an acronym of GPS. So we talk about that we GPS our force. We generate, present, and sustain our force. And that means we're accountable for the performance and readiness today of 11 deltas and 2 garrisons, with just under 16,000 assigned Guardians Airmen, and then that's military and civilian alike. Now, we're going to give up 3 of those deltas in the coming weeks and months as STARCOM and Space Systems Command stand up, and then we'll get down to our fighting weight, which is 8 deltas and 2 garrisons and the missions that they perform. Let me talk briefly about the relationship with our other field commands. So as I've alluded to, we do expect Space Systems Command to stand up in the next couple of months. Now, that's dependent on Senate confirmation. And of course, per the Constitution, the Senate will consider that nomination of Major General Mike Gutlein to be the Space Systems Command Commander. And when they're ready, hopefully we'll get a positive vote on that. Until then, Space and Missile Systems Center out at LA will continue to be our equipping command. In fact, today, Lieutenant General J.T. Thompson retires out at SMC, and just want to offer my personal thanks for his outstanding leadership and friendship and mentorship in the space community. We have been very, very lucky to have him. But Space Systems Command will be the lead equipping command for Space Force. Now, others will be involved. We have a Space Rapid Capability Office at Kirtland that does outstanding work. We have the Department of the Air Force Rapid Capability Office that will continue to support us. And there's others in our enterprise that help us field capability. But very proud of how SMC has pulled together those organizations into a collaborative forum to help make sure that all that kit is coming to us in a way that we can best utilize. And when Space Systems Command stands up, we will hand them from SpOC our launch enterprise. So the old 30th Space Wing and 45th Space Wing that we call Space Launch Delta 30 and Space Launch Delta 45 today, those will transition over to Space Systems Command. And we're excited about that opportunity where SSC can oversee the whole launch enterprise from working with private industry to buy those launch capabilities and then operate the ranges from which we'll launch them. They'll get those, they'll get our payloads on orbit, get them to the operational location. We will have tested them out with STARCOM, and then they'll be presented to SpOC to execute on behalf of U.S. Space Command. And that leads us to STARCOM, Space Training and Readiness Command. I think we'll see some exciting announcements in the coming weeks about when that will happen, but we definitely think that will happen this summer, that it will stand up. And its responsibility is to improve the lethality of the overall Space Force by developing combat-ready space forces and space warfighting TTPs and expertise. So those of you familiar with the Air Force, think taking the Air Force Warfare Center at Nellis, which both Kevin and I had the great opportunity to be a part of, where we do high-end training for our best tacticians and do TTP development. And we're going to combine that with the elements of the Air Education and Training Command for basic training and initial skills training. We're going to link that with other aspects of AETC that did education, the National Space Security Institute. We're also going to bring in the elements of the AFOTech that do operational test and evaluation, and all of that will be a part of STARCOM. And those are actually areas that we did not do as well as we could have in the Air Force construct. We just never resourced them at the same level the flying community did. So you're going to see a real focus in Space Force to make sure we are plussing up the resourcing in those areas so that we can really focus on the warfighter and the TTPs and making sure that we are going to win by having better trained people and better capabilities in TTPs that have been rigorously tested. STARCOM will also evolve space warfighting doctrine, wargaming, and tactics. Those of you familiar with the Shriver Wargame series, that will end up in STARCOM, and they'll be the lead for the service in executing that critical war game. They're going to help us transition capabilities from the development community, acquisition community into operations through rigorous test and evaluation, as I've mentioned. And when they stand up, hopefully this summer, as I mentioned, you're going to see 5 deltas that will come with Space Systems Command: a delta focused on training, a doctrine and wargaming delta, a range and aggressor delta, a test and evaluation delta, and an education delta. And when that happens, Star Delta, that's a part of SpOC today, which has all of those capabilities in it, will stand down and will birth out those 5 deltas that I just mentioned. I've said a couple times that we're getting down to our fighting weight. Unlike other organizations in Space Force that are standing up from scratch, we're more like a sculptor who's carving out what it is that we're going to become from a block of granite, or to use a UFC Ultimate Fighting example, we are a fighter getting down to that fighting weight. We've been heavier in the past as we've trained. We might like to carry a little more weight occasionally, but we've been given a weight that we need to fight at, and we're going to get down to that fighting weight. And so once we pass off Star Delta and once we pass off the launch enterprise, we'll be down to all the capabilities that we as a service present to U.S. Space Command will be focused on those presented capabilities, again, being that fight tonight force that I mentioned earlier. Let me just talk briefly about the tactical organizations below us, the deltas and the garrisons. If you go back to early 2019, then Major General John Shaw, as the Deputy Commander of Air Force Space Command, under the leadership of General Raymond, stood up a team to start planning what a Space Force might look like. Of course, the law had not been passed yet, but we started lead turning that. And John and his team came up with this idea of standing up a Space Force with 3 field commands, one being an operational command, one being an equipping command, and one being this training and readiness focused command. And that's what's largely survived as we're continuing to build out the field commands. But they also said, you know what, our Air Force structure with wings, and by the way, loved those organizations. I got to command the 21st Space Wing. They did dilute the focus of our senior leadership teams, where a wing commander at the 21st had to be worried about running all the facilities here in Colorado Springs at Peterson and Cheyenne Mountain, had to be worried about Thule and other small bases around the United States. And then they had this giant operational arm as well, doing missile warning, ground-based missile warning, doing space control, and doing space domain awareness. And it just diffused that officer's focus. And so we said, you know what, we're going to fix that by standing up new mission-focused organizations. And we're going to give those mission-focused commanders a single space mission. And that's where we've ended up with deltas. And delta is a unique term we came up with because we didn't want to use wing. That's kind of an Air Force term, or brigade. That's an Army term. So we came up with our own term, a delta. And now if you're the Space Delta 3 commander, you have all Space Force space electronic warfare capability. And if you're the Space Delta 4 commander, you have all missile warning capability. We've combined space-based and ground-based. And we're really seeing how this is giving a sense of ownership to those leadership teams and allowing them to focus in ways we couldn't in the past, such that General Deanna Burt, my vice commander out at Vandenberg, who's dual-hatted as the Combined Force Space Component Commander, she now tasks many of the Delta commanders to be an overall task force lead. So for example, Space Delta 3, Colonel John Thien, he has been tasked as the Task Force Space Electronic Warfare Lead, which means he pulls together Space Force and Army space electronic warfare capability and does joint planning for General Burt and gives her one-stop shop on how to arrange and execute, or pardon me, how to execute her assigned electronic warfare capabilities to best effect. We also thought it would be good, as we're standing up these space-focused organizations, to stand up installation-focused organizations, and that's our garrisons. And so think about them as like an airbase wing. 99.9% of the people in those organizations are airmen executing the critical functions that allow our bases to be power projection platforms. So they're the security, they're the chaplains, they're the logistics readiness, they're the medical. But we decided early on we wanted a Space Force officer to command those organizations, to help ensure that those garrisons feel tightly linked to the space mission. And as you probably saw yesterday here on the Front Range, we renamed Peterson and Schriever as Space Force bases, and we renamed Cheyenne Mountain as a Space Force station. Again, just to help with that linkage of our unique identity, even with the airmen that we have, who we're so proud to have assigned to us, that they're a critical part of all that we're doing on these installations. Let me talk just briefly about the target culture that we're trying to build here at SpOC. We want it to be service-oriented. We want it to be proactive in addressing the challenges of the future. We want it to be agile as we work to rapidly shift focus based on any external tasking that comes or new threats that emerge. We want it to be collaborative, that we're working across our staff in a cohesive manner to support our deltas and garrisons. We want it to be empowered, and we want it to have open communication. And I'll close with one final topic area, and that's our recent reorganization here at Headquarters SpOC. Of course, we inherited the Air Force Space Command structure, which was built around an A staff, a Napoleonic model that has served us well. But as we focus now down and in on our deltas, we wanted a new structure. And so we've come up with a structure that's built around Deputy Commanding Generals, or DCGs. And we've done that for 2 reasons again. Number one, it is different from our Air Force structure, so that forces us to act differently and to start being building a unique service identity and way of operating. But it does still map relatively well to a Napoleonic structure, so we can still integrate well with U.S. Space Command, and we can integrate up to our service headquarters, who has a unique structure. And then the second reason we picked this is because it is familiar to our joint teammates. The Army uses a deputy commanding general model. So here at headquarters SpOC, the senior leadership team, as I mentioned, Major General Deanna Bird out at Vandenberg is my vice commander. Chief John Bentavania is my senior enlisted leader. But right below us, we now have 3 deputy commanding generals. We have Deputy Commanding General for Operations, Brigadier General Doug Shess, who combines the old elements of the 2, the 3, the 5, the 6, and the 10 to do both current operations and to look into the future to integrate future capability. And the really exciting part of that is we've done that by building around mission area teams. So each of our Delta commanders, for example, Colonel Casey Beard, the Space Delta 9 Orbital Warfare Commander, he now has a mission area team in the DCGO Ops led by either a colonel or a GS-15 to work all of his issues, current operations issues and future integration issues. And that mission area team, or MAT, is his one-stop shop into the headquarters. Now, Colonel Beard can still go talk to the 1 if he needs, can go talk to the 8 if he needs, but that mission area team is also where he can go anytime for any issue to be worked on his behalf. And we're seeing a real tight coupling and teaming between that Delta commander and that mission area team lead in executing those missions. Our second DCG is DCG support, led by Brigadier General Kristen Goodwin, where we combined our 1, our 4, and our 8. The 1 and the 8 are doing the typical things you expect for a 1 and an 8, except they're doing them for our field comm. We are no longer doing those for the entire enterprise. Still supporting STARCOM and others, but we're focused on SpOC as we are a service component to U.S. Space Command. Our 4 is not the 4 you're thinking of. Most of you, when you think of a 4, think of supporting an installation with higher headquarters support for security forces, for medical, for civil engineering. All of those functions are moving to the Air Force, actually Air Force Material Command, under something called the Servicing MAGCOM, and I'd be happy to answer a question about that if any arise. But that means our 4 is focused on the generate, present, and sustain tasks. That's maintenance, that's sustainment, and it's facility readiness. Because HVAC and power are the jet fuel of the Space Force in the same way that jet fuel fuels the Air Force. And so we have to care about the readiness of those HVAC and power systems, among other critical systems out there. And then our last DCG is DCG transformation. That's led by Brigadier General Kevin Whale of the Royal Canadian Air Force, who's been assigned to our headquarters. And this is where we put in several existing functions like the Chief Data Officer, the Chief Scientist, our Military and International Affairs Office, and our innovation efforts. But this is really about creating the future. How can we really inculcate innovation and a digital force across SpOC? How can we elevate the role of partnerships in our command? And we're excited about them helping us to invent the future. It's a small but mighty team that's working that. And then lastly, we have a director of staff who leads all of our special staff on our behalf and then helps pull together functions at the field command level. All right, I think I've talked right at 30 minutes, probably a little faster than I intended, but hopefully that gives you an overview of what we've been doing in SpOC, our missions, and how we're organized. And I look forward to the questions, Chris and General McLaughlin, that you or the listeners may have.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that enlightening presentation. You covered a lot of ground in a hurry. We appreciate it very much. For our first question, I'm pleased to turn to Lieutenant General Kevin McLaughlin. Kevin, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. General Whiting, you gave us a great breadth of remarks, and thanks for the status broadly. And a number of our questions will touch on things that you've mentioned, but maybe just ask for a little bit more depth or color in them. The first is you did talk about how SpOC, one of the key hats that you wear is as the service component to U.S. Space Command from the Space Force. Could you just talk a little bit more about two things broadly? One, you mentioned the way that General Burt is able to task organize as she presents capability and conducts missions. I wanted to ask the first question is, Does she, would you foresee that she might at times even create task forces that cut across deltas for certain assigned missions? And then secondly, could you just talk a little bit more about how the relationships with the various combatant commands are evolving as y'all stand up, especially with US Space Command and US Cyber Command?
Yeah, thanks for the question, sir. On your first question of cross-cutting task forces, yes. So for example, General Burt has tapped the commander of Space Delta 2, which is Colonel Mark Brock, and that's our Space Domain Awareness Delta. She has tapped him to be the lead for Task Force SDA. Task Force SDA encompasses not only the space domain awareness capabilities of Space Delta 2, but it also includes Space Delta 4, which is our missile warning delta, ground-based and space-based radar, ground-based radars and space-based missile warning capabilities that have SDA abilities. And then Space Delta 9 with our GSAP satellites also is able to do space domain awareness. And then there's some Army elements that can do space domain awareness. So Mark Brock pulls all of that together for tactical level planning on behalf of General Burt. And I hope that got after your question on cross-cutting task forces. And then on the evolving relationships with other combatant commands, certainly we have a very rich multi-decadal relationship with the Director of Space Forces out in all those combatant commands. And I know, sir, you were a former DIR Space 4 in CENTCOM. And so they have very rich relationships back to the Combined Force Space Component Command and the SPOC at Vandenberg to provide real-time space support. Now, in a world in which we have a Space Force, we don't think it makes sense anymore that the air component commanders out in the various combatant commands are the lead for space integration and command and control in those other combatant commands. So what you're going to see moving forward is that the Space Force is working to stand up service components in the other combatant commands, and we'll have to do that in a phased manner, focusing on the combatant commands that are most on the front lines of the national defense strategy to begin with, and then we'll grow that out over time. But I think we will end up with service components representing space equities in those other combatant commands. We'll still be tightly partnered with our air brethren. We think leveraging the AOCs that they have will give us great command and control capabilities, and obviously we'll be in support of their missions just as we'll ask them to be in support of our missions. But I hope that gives you a little taste of where we might be going with those evolving relationships.
It absolutely does. Thank you very much.
And the next question, wearing your operational hat, sir, what do you see as the greatest threats that the United States faces to our on-orbit and terrestrial space systems? Is it cyber, supply chain attacks, co-orbital or direct-to-send ASATs, jamming, something else? And more broadly, how would you characterize intelligence support to America's space warfighters?
Yeah, those are two big questions. I almost could flippantly say, with all those 5 or 6 things you mentioned, is what's the biggest threat? I could just say yes. I mean, all of that is out there right now. And let me start by talking about cyber. We do view it as our soft underbelly. Certainly, China and Russia are building counter space capabilities that we have called out publicly when they've tested those direct-to-send ASATs, when they've tested co-orbital ASATs. When they've had unprofessional, unsafe behavior on orbit. So they are investing their nation's riches to try to take us on in the space domain. But even as they're doing that, they are investing to take us on in the cyber domain. And for other actors like Iran and North Korea, the bar is much lower for them to try to go after us in cyber. So it's one of the reasons I'm very excited that we brought in cyber guardians to help us defend that cyber domain, and happy to address those questions. But then the whole other range of threats that you just highlighted, from non-kinetic all the way up to kinetic, we are seeing all of those, and we're publicly talking about them more and more. And it's the reason that we have a Space Force and a new U.S. Space Command today. Now, I think your second question was on how are we evolving intelligence capabilities on behalf of the Space Force? Was that correct, Chris?
The degree of intel support that you're receiving today.
Yeah, thank you. When I am asked about what I'm most excited about in SPOC, there's a lot, but what I point to at the beginning of that list is the opportunity with our Space Delta 7, which is our ISR Delta, and Space Delta 6, which is our Cyber Delta. So I'll focus on Space Delta 7. Space Delta 7 was created last year by bringing in the parts of the intel community, our intelligence that we had in the old Air Force Space Command. That was our wing intelligence shops, which were pretty small. They were growing. We had been investing in them. But we also brought into Space Delta 7 the old 544th ISR group from Air Combat Command, plus some additional assets that the Air Force had that were supporting, had primary missions of supporting space intel. Now, all of that is together in Space Delta 7. So in the past, Air Force Space Command never had Title 50 authorities. Those resided in Air Combat Command, and certainly we indirectly got support from that. But now all of that is in Space Delta 7. So we're able to bring Title 50 authorities and information right down to the individual space operations centers. And today the Air Force is being fantastic teammates. Lieutenant General Tim Hawk out at 16th Air Force is serving as our service cryptological component commander. That will transition into Space Force when we're ready to take that. And Major General Leah Lauterbach at Space Force headquarters, our S2 there, she's working that. But Air Force is just being fantastic teammates. But then Space Delta 7 has created detachments that live in each of our other deltas, and they're named after that delta. So Space Delta 7, its detachment number 2 is the Intel Delta that lives with Space Delta 2, Space Domain Awareness, providing all that information to that delta. And we do that across all of our deltas. Now we're going to continue to grow our Intel enterprise. You'll see investments and stand up of new units. You've probably heard General Lauterbach and General D.T. Thompson, General Raymond talking about creating a National Space Intel Center as well. So more work to do to grow out the Intel enterprise we need, but I'm excited about the path we're on.
That's great. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. General Whiting, you mentioned a little bit about how your new DCG for transformation will be working on some of the things associated with becoming a digital service. With the fielding of the new U.S. Space Force vision for a digital service, which was an awesome document. Could you give us some thoughts about what in practice you think some of that transformation might mean and how SpOC, what role it might play in the broader, both within the organization, but in the broader service-wide effort to become a digital service?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. So in the strategy that you're alluding to, General Raymond highlights 4 lines of effort in becoming a digital service. One is digital headquarters, changing how we operate at the headquarters level. Second, digital operations, using digital tools to actually change how we operate at the tactical level. Number 3, digital engineering. How do we start with our requirements process and do it all in the digital space, and then design systems in a digital space, and then ultimately produce real capability based on those digital designs. And then those digital designs can even move into our training simulators. That's kind of digital engineering. And then 4th, digital workforce. How do we make sure our guardians and assigned airmen are ready to operate in this world? So for SpOC, our 2 primary focuses on those lines of effort are the first 2 that I mentioned: digital headquarters and digital operations. When I first came in, we did not have computers on every desktop. In fact, when I came in the service in 1989, I was the last class at the Air Force Academy that was not issued computers. And so we did everything on printed sheets of paper, still had typewriters. And much of that staff work that we did 32 years ago is really done very similarly today, but it's just now done on Microsoft Word. So digital headquarters is really about, instead of just taking the old process and putting it on a computer, how do we fundamentally change how we operate in a headquarters staff? And so DCG transformation under General Whale is out looking at different tools that might move us off the legacy email and some of the legacy things we've been doing. And we have some deltas that are really forward leaning and thinking about some of these new tools and how they can operate differently. And how can that change how our headquarters operates day to day? And then the second one is that digital operations. We still have way too many manual interfaces. We don't have machine-to-machine interfaces between our weapons systems. If you think about a future in which a orbital or a direct ascent ASAT from launch to bang is in a matter of minutes, 4 to 9 minutes, how do we pass that information around in a digital way that allows us to operate faster and more quickly? So that we're focused on that as well here at SpOC. So a lot of work still left to do, but those are the two key facets that I think SpOC is going to be able to support General Raymond's vision.
Great, thank you very much. Chris?
Thank you. Two-part question here, sir. How can U.S. industry better assist SpOC in accomplishing its vital missions? And can you talk a little bit about some of the future opportunities that U.S. industry should be aware of in this regard? And then the second part of the question comes from our audience. The question asks, who leads the Space Force security and information connection functions? As the service and commands develop more and more classified programs, it's increasingly difficult to track the programs, requirements, and budgets. Industry wants to help, but we cannot connect or pass data on programs due to security limitations. Can you address both of those aspects, sir?
Yeah, the first one's definitely easier than the second one, but I think the first one's focused on how can industry help and what are those opportunities. Let me talk about a couple areas as I look around our enterprise. And I'm not talking for all of Space Force. I'm going to talk for SpOC. And again, we're a fight tonight force. We are not the equipping force. So if you want to talk about the next generation of satellites and whatnot, that'll be a conversation for others to lead. But as I look across our force, we continue to need to bake in cyber defenses right up front. Now, we do have the world's best space architecture, but much of it was designed in that 1990s era when we truly were in an uncontested benign environment. So now we're having to go back and kind of bolt on cyber defenses. So we are looking for all the opportunities that are out there for how can we improve cyber defenses of our existing architecture and then make sure those are built into our new systems that are coming to harden that soft underbelly that I mentioned earlier. I also would highlight that I think space and cyber are two domains that absolutely lend themselves to a very rich simulation environment where we should be giving our warfighters advanced simulators that are flying their particular satellites in a physics-based reality way, and that we can introduce red threats so they can train against those threats. We do not have that today, and we have not been able to deliver that. So looking for good ideas on how we could do that going forward. And my sense is we should be able to do that pretty quickly. And again, just something we've struggled with over time. And then I'll highlight space domain awareness. Of course, we have the best space domain awareness capabilities in the world, but yet we still need to improve those. And I know there's several companies that are working in that space, but looking to how we better utilize the data we have and how we go about getting additional data so that we can really have that holistic picture of what's on orbit. I'm sure there's other things as well, but that's three that come to mind. And then this, I would like to enter a conversation with the person about this security and info connection process. We are striving to make efforts to continue to lower the classification levels of many of our systems. Space electronic warfare is one of those areas where 5 years ago I could not have talked about it the way I've talked about it on this interview, and certainly we have to continue to make progress. But I guess I would say I think the lead for that would be likely at the space staff, probably starting with General Armano, our director of staff there. But again, really would like to enter into a dialogue with that individual to understand exactly what they're picking at more there. So sorry, that's an inadequate answer.
No, that's great. We'll follow up. Kevin?
General Whiting, you talked about the important role that both Space Delta 6 and 7 are going to play and playing now in SpOC. And you gave us some really good additional detail on sort of what's happening in Space Delta 7 in terms of as it grows and connects to the rest of the broader environment. Could you describe, are there similar things happening with Space Delta 6 in terms of how it's growing and maturing and partnering with other parts of the DoD and the Air Force and the Space Force?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Space Delta 6 is doing a lot of great work. Let me talk about the first part of their mission, and then I'll move on to talk about cyber. But the part that I'll mention up front and then I'll move off is they operate the satellite control network, what we previously called the AFSCN. And so they ensure that we have the connectivity from our operations floors to talk to our satellites and all the orbital regimes. And they're doing great work there, working, managing that older system that it continues to support us as we continue to launch out more capability. But then the part that you're asking about is they are our cyber defenders. And so we've come up with a vision of where we want to go with our cyber guardians. And that starts with building out mission defense teams across all of our mission areas. Now, for those who may not be familiar, a mission defense team is a dedicated team of cyber guardians who live day to day on a single weapon system or like grouping of weapon systems to understand the pattern of life on that weapon system to ensure that there aren't bad cyber actors who are trying to infiltrate that. And so we have a pretty robust team at Buckley Buckley Space Force Base today in the 62nd Cyber Squadron. And when you go up there, it's eye-watering watching these cyber guardians talk about defending the SBIRS space-based infrared weapon system, and they sound like they're space operators. They really understand that mission and that mission system, and they're there every day protecting that system. Well, we want to grow that out across all of our capabilities. That will take some time, that will take investment. But then after we've done that, we also then see that we need to pivot or let me say at the same time we're doing that, we need to pivot our cyber guardians out of providing base operations communications, our base infrastructure communications. Telephones and the Nipper computers on my desk, those are all important, but that's not what we need our cyber guardians focused on. So we're going to pivot them away from that work and focus them on either cyber defense or on mission comm. And by mission comm, we mean the specialized communications that directly support our mission area. So think like satellite communications at Buckley Space Force Base. Our SBIRS infrastructure is reliant on satellite communications, and so we have a team of SATCOM guardians who run that for us, and that's an appropriate place for them to be. So after we've done that pivot, after we've stood up our mission defense teams, we see a future in which Space Force will build out cyber protection teams, or CPTs, which are maneuver forces that can be rapidly shifted among various mission systems to do deeper dives or deeper hunt missions to make sure that we're protecting those systems, and it gives the commander that maneuver capability. And then we see a future down the road where we even build out offensive capability, because who better for the nation to think about how we use the cyber domain to advance our space superiority missions than guardians who grow up their whole career thinking about space. And so that's a vision that we have, a lot more work to do to resource that, but that's kind of where we're headed with Space Delta 6. And I hope that got after your question, General McLaughlin.
It did. Thank you very much.
Sir, the U.S. Space Force recently established the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, or SWAC, led by Andrew Cox. How does SPOC engage with the SWAC, and what influence does SPOC have on that organization's agenda and its analysis of future capabilities and architectures?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And baked into that question was kind of what the role of SWAC is. It is to do force design for the Chief of Space Operations. And we're excited about that. And of course, it brings the rich analytical history and reputation of SSDP, the Space Security and Defense Program. So SWAC will report directly to General Raymond, and they will support the Chief Strategy and Resourcing Officer, CSRO, think the 589 on the space staff, in developing requirements through this architecting and force design effort that they're going to do. SPOC will be the voice of the warfighter in those deliberations. In fact, just last week, we had a very great engagement with them, a deep dive across multiple days on much of the work that they're doing. And so that's our role through those mission area teams that I highlighted earlier in our assigned deltas, is to be there helping them with that analysis, giving them insights into what the warfighter needs, and then they'll develop that force design, and then working with the CSRO, we will develop requirements that then will end up going through the requirements process and ultimately generating future capability. Still some work to do as that new SWAC organization stands up and as we mature those processes. But again, this is another area where I'm excited where we're headed as a service.
That's great. Kevin?
Sorry, I need to learn how to use the mute button. General Whiting, you mentioned a couple of times, and really all throughout sort of foundational U.S. Space Force documents, is this notion that's tied to culture, both the warfighting culture, the U.S. Space Force vision for a digital service, as we discussed, wasn't just a technical document on how you do a digital force technically, but it also talked about culture all throughout. Could you give us some just thoughts from your perch as the SpOC commander? You've laid out some of the attributes of the culture that you would like to have, but what are the things you do to actually implement that culture, whether it's for new Guardians or existing Guardians that grew up in the same, kind of the same culture that I grew up in as a young space officer? What are the unique challenges and tools that you're using to sort of implement that culture and make sure that it's happening the way that you want it to?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well. It's something that we're constantly thinking about, is the culture that we have. And of course, we've been handed the world's greatest space capabilities, and we're proud of our history in the U.S. Air Force. But we also know that that wasn't good enough, and now we have to really accelerate the focus on defending space on behalf of the United States. I remember back in the early 90s when we were coming out of the Gulf War, there was the base force review. I think I'm missing the name there slightly, but it was a review across all the services where the services just drastically came down. Hundreds of thousands of people left the services during those years, and there were rifts, and it was a tough time. And I remember Congress was very focused on morale across the services. And this may be an apocryphal story, but I kind of remember it being true, but it might not be. But I remember a reporter kind of going around asking, various soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, whether there was a morale problem in their service. And the story I remember was they asked a young Marine, is there a morale problem in the Marine Corps? And this young Marine said, no, the commandant said we didn't have a morale problem, therefore we don't have a morale problem. And so I use that to bridge the culture, because we know we cannot just say the CSO said we're going to have a warfighting culture, therefore we have a warfighting culture. It is about setting the construct and then allowing that culture to emerge from the base plate level at the squadron and delta level. So what are those things that, as you asked, that we're setting up in the environment? It's everything. It's the structure that we set up. And we think this new flatter structure where we've pulled out one level of 06 command and one level of general officer command has made us flatter and more agile. And just by the span of control of certainly SpOC, we are putting more responsibility on those Delta commanders where they really own their mission. And now we've built a structure in our headquarters that they have a one-stop shop, a partner who works with them every day to enable their mission, today's mission and the future mission that's coming. So that's an important part of this. They just have less levels of oversight, which is giving them more responsibility. Our flatter structure is more agile. It is regular that I get a question from a squadron or Delta or garrison commander, and within the day, we've gotten an answer back from the vice chief of the Space Force or the chief of the Space Force or the chief master sergeant of the Space Force. So we're just being much more agile than we could in the past. We have to change our awards. Are the awards that we're giving people, annual awards, quarterly awards, are they living up to what we're saying in our foundational documents about innovation and about all the things that we value as warfighters? So we've done a review of our awards program. That's a small item, but it's true. The heroes that we hold up, who are they? The facilities that we work on, what are they called? And so as I mentioned, we've renamed the bases. But it's each and every one of those decisions. It's the names we give our organizations. It's the names we give our guardians. All of that together comes and intersects in a way that now we want to see that warfighting culture emerge. This will be a multi-decadal process. An important part will be bringing in inter-service transfers from the Army, the Navy, and Marines. And probably saw in the press in the last couple of weeks, we've named, I think, the first 50. Next year, there'll be several hundred that are coming. And we have to be open to learning from them. They don't have an Air Force background, so we need to bring in the best from their cultures as well. I know that's not a crisp answer, Kevin, but it's the things we're thinking about as we're also focused on letting that culture emerge in a positive manner that's focused on warfighting.
I think it's a very, very good answer, and you've got me so excited. If I could become a second lieutenant again, I'd be ready to start right away. I have to lose a little weight though, but I'm ready to go.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Thank you again, Lieutenant General Whiting. Last question is, you were recently quoted as saying, "It would not surprise me if in the career of young Guardians joining today, we have manned missions on orbit. The capabilities that we're seeing now built in commercial industry, funded by the commercial industry, will give us those kinds of opportunities." Could you share with us your view on the importance of cislunar space to U.S. national security and economic interests? And is the Space Force engaged in serious planning about possible manned missions in space?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. On the last part of that, the answer right now is no. Certainly, we have a couple Space Force astronauts, and very proud of them and what they do to support NASA. However, as we look into the future and we see the trends where we see private industry talking about going to the moon and to Mars and beyond, that's what I was highlighting in the quote you just mentioned, that history says that when commerce goes somewhere, that we've had a need to have defense there as well. So cislunar, today we see the interest of other countries in cislunar. Of course, we landed multiple men on the moon in the 1960s, and I know NASA is committed to going back, and we're excited about that. But through the Air Force Research Laboratory, which has elements of it that are from the Space Force, so a couple elements of the old AFRL came to the Space Force, and then we've represented those back to AFRL so that Major General Heather Pringle can operate that as a single unified lab supporting both the Air Force and the Space Force. But parts of that AFRL are working prototype missions to go to cislunar to improve our space domain awareness capability. So we definitely see that mission area coming. I think the investments that AFRL is executing on our behalf right now are the appropriate ones for now. But as we continue to see how other countries use cislunar and beyond, and as we see where commerce goes and beyond and what threats might emerge, then I think you'll see more work in the cislunar area. And then we'll see. As I said, I think in a 20 or 30-year career arc from now, we could have manned missions on or in orbit. And we'll see how that plays out. But just like Joe McLaughlin, I wish I was young again and could experience the next 20 to 30 years as a Guardian, because I think they're going to be transformational. Let me just say one last thing. There's a human tendency, and there's a name for this law, and I just forget what it is, that we overestimate technological change in the short term, and then we get disappointed and we have that valley of despair, but we underestimate technological change in the short term, in the long term. So 20 to 30 years from now, I can't even begin to think where we might be, but I know that all these converging trends are really going to provide an exciting future for the young Guardians who are joining us today.
Well, that's fantastic. Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, thank you for your time today and your decades-long service to our nation. Kevin McLaughlin, thank you for joining with us today. And for our audience, we appreciate your time. And that's a wrap for our latest edition of SpaceTime. We'll be back at you again next week with an interview with Colonel Eric Felt. Look forward to that. And again, everyone have a great day. General Whiting, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work, sir.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Joe McLaughlin, and thanks to the NSSA.
Yes, sir.